Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. Welcome to WWF session on scaling up solutions to addressing the triple challenge. This is the second of 3 WWF sessions on the triple challenge, how to secure livelihoods and feed a growing global population while addressing climate change and safeguarding nature. I'm Margaret Kulo, Interim Global Conservation Director at WWF, and I'll be your host and moderator for this 90-minute session. We heard in the last session how the COVID-19 pandemic underscores our connection with nature. We also heard a lot about people-centered approaches to this triple challenge. To change our relationship with nature, to change business as usual, we need integrated solutions that will break the silos between sectors. And that's what we're going to focus on in the next 90 minutes. This concept of a triple challenge raises complex questions. How do we scale up solutions, such as reducing food loss and waste, and also address trade-offs between climate, food, and biodiversity restoration priorities? In this session, we'll hear more about the triple challenge and what it means. We'll have a short presentation, and then we have an exciting group of panelists who will share their experience and ideas and their thoughts on this question of trade-offs. We also want to make sure to hear from you during the course of the session. You can use your chat box to introduce yourself to each other, where you're joining us from today, and you can submit questions for speakers in the Q&A tab, which will be open throughout the session. There you can comment, add your questions, and also comment and vote on others' questions. Also, if you haven't read our white paper on the triple challenge yet, you can find it on the session page and in the link that will also be posted in your chat box. With that, I'd like to introduce Dave Tickner, Chief Freshwater Advisor at WWF UK and one of the authors of the triple challenge paper. Dave advises on international river conservation and water resource programs and engages governments and the private sector on water and sustainability issues. Thanks very much, Dave. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Margaret, and hello, everyone. Margaret, can you hear me okay? Just confirm that.
Your audio is great. Thank you very much, Dave.
Good. And if you could just confirm if I share my screen, you can see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Great. Thanks very much. Okay, the triple challenge. We need to avoid dangerous climate change. We need to secure nutritious, healthy diets for 9, perhaps 10 billion people, maybe even more. And we need to make space for nature. This is one of the defining challenges of our time, of my career, I guess, of all of our careers. At WWF, we've been doing a lot of thinking about this. How do we support decision makers, stakeholders, rights holders to navigate this triple challenge, accounting for the fact that it looks different in different contexts? Obviously, there'll be multiple different perspectives on it. It's politically, socially, economically, culturally and environmentally a complex challenge, as Margaret has said. One of the things that we've noted is that there's really quite a lot of work out there already, quite a lot of insights out there already on aspects of the triple challenge, either individual aspects, clearly lots has been done on climate change, on food security, on biodiversity. And there's quite a lot of work now on coupled aspects, so the links between climate change and agriculture, for example, or the impacts of agriculture on biodiversity. But there's relatively little work out there at the moment on all three aspects together, on the feedbacks and the complexities that are involved in tackling the challenge as a triple challenge. The purpose of this session, the purpose of this presentation is to really gain some extra insights from our panelists and hopefully from you as an audience as well. And this presentation is really just intended to kick off some of the thought processes around that. And I thought I'd start close to home. As Margaret said, I'm based in the UK. It seems a long time ago now, but back in December, we held a general election. There are a number of issues which dominated that general election. Brexit, if you remember that, was one of them. Our National Health Service was another. But happily, one of the issues that really rose to the top of the agenda as well was climate change and the environment more broadly. And one of the notable features of the election debate was around tree planting. So pretty much all the major parties who contested the election made promises about how many trees they could plant in the UK. Our Conservative Party, led by Boris Johnson, who of course eventually won the election, said in their manifesto that they would plant 30 million trees a year in the UK. Our Labour Party said they'd plant 100 million. Our Liberal Democrats said 60 million. Our Green Party said 70 million. Now, we can argue the merits of all of those promises, but they're big numbers and they pose questions. In particular, where should those trees go? Clearly, if they went on farmland, good agricultural land, there's an opportunity cost there in terms of growing food. If they go on valuable non-forest habitats, there's an opportunity cost there in terms of biodiversity. And it's important as we think about how those promises are going to be implemented going forward, how we plant 30 million trees a year, which was the Conservative Party promise, that we learn from the past. When I was growing up and as a young environmentalist, one of the first debates I remember really making the news about the environment in the UK was about forestation in the far north of Scotland in a landscape called the Flow Country. The Flow Country is one of Europe's largest peatlands. It's not naturally a forested landscape. But in the 1970s and 1980s, the UK government gave tax breaks to investors to invest in forestry in places like the Flow Country. And as a result, you ended up with a lot of plantations of non-native conifers in what was now a drained peatland. That might have been intended to support the forestry sector, although as it happens, I understand a lot of the trees weren't very happy on that peatland and the forestry wasn't terribly successful. Clearly, from a carbon point of view, draining peatland isn't a good idea. And from a biodiversity point of view, the Flow Country is a remarkable habitat for a lot of quite valuable biodiversity. The trade-offs there between promoting tree planting and biodiversity and carbon mitigation are plain for all to see. Moving a little further afield to Tanzania, to the Great Ruaha River Basin, which might be the most strategically important river in Tanzania. In the uplands of the Great Ruaha, there's an important agricultural landscape, one of the breadbaskets of Tanzania. Further downstream, we have Ruaha National Park, which I think is the largest national park in Eastern Africa. And for my mind, having been lucky enough to be there a few times, one of Africa's best kept secrets. It's a remarkable place for wildlife. Further downstream again, we have two hydroelectric dams, the Mtera Dam and the bigger Kidatu Dam, which generate a significant proportion of Tanzania's electricity. Linking all of these areas is the river, the Great Ruaha River. Now, what's been observed over the last 20 or 25 years in Tanzania is that as agriculture has developed in the uplands, often in an unplanned way, more and more water has been used for irrigation. And as a result, in particular in the dry season, flows of the river through the national park and potentially down to the dams have been adversely affected, which means the wildlife is suffering and potentially there's going to be concern about the ability of Kidatu Dam to generate the hydropower that Tanzania needs. So there's trade-offs there around the use of the river and around the use of land between agriculture, wildlife, and low carbon electricity generation. It's worth noting that hydropower and gas generation are the two main sources of electricity in Tanzania. So if Kidatu Dam is affected by low river flows caused by upstream irrigation, then potentially that means more gas-powered generation. The government of Tanzania has said that restoring the flow of the Great Ruaha River is a national priority. But it's also said that Tanzania's push for economic development is going to be centered around agriculture And as part of that, it's designated this stretch of south central Tanzania as the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, SAGCOT. It's trying to mobilize billions of dollars of investment for agricultural growth in exactly that area that cuts across the Great Ruaha River. So again, there are trade-offs there, pushing for agriculturally based economic development, the ability of places like Ruaha National Park to host thriving wildlife, and the generation of low carbon electricity. A third landscape to look at, the Mekong in Southeast Asia. Again, dams feature here. An increasing number of dams are being built, particularly on the main stem of the Mekong. China has built a number. Laos is now building a number of dams. There's real concern about the impacts of those dams on freshwater fisheries, and those freshwater fisheries are probably the most important protein source for about 60 million people who live in the Mekong Basin. This begs the question that if the fish stocks are affected by the dams, and there's every chance that they will be, where will those 60 million people get their protein from? Chances are they'll probably get some of that replacement protein from livestock. Where will the livestock go? Well, they'll have to go on the land somewhere, and much of the basin is still forested. So potentially, generation of hydropower from dams in the Mekong could affect food security for many people, could affect forest biodiversity. And it's even more complex than that, because further downstream in Vietnam, the Mekong Delta is the rice basket of Southeast Asia. There's about 20 million Vietnamese rice farmers who depend on the flows of nutrients and of sediment coming down the river to maintain the low-lying delta above rising seas. If more dams are built, more sediment gets trapped, that replenishment of the land gets interrupted. And it's been quite interesting to see recent pronouncements from senior figures in the Vietnamese government about the need for an emergency plan for the Mekong Delta. Now, all three of those examples I've given you are from markedly different contexts, economically, culturally, politically, environmentally. But as we see the Anthropocene take hold, as we see this rapid acceleration, this great acceleration of environmental trends globally in terms of our use of natural resources, our use of land, we're likely to see more of these situations around the world. Indeed, the three situations I've given you aren't particularly unusual. So the triple challenge is really taking hold even as we speak now. What do we do about it? Well, the one thing that's fairly clear is that if we want to avoid the most perverse consequences or the most unforeseen impacts, negative impacts on either food security or biodiversity, or on our ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and limit climate change, we're probably going to have to go about some of these strategic decisions a little bit differently. I really love this quote that's often attributed, perhaps wrongly, to Albert Einstein, that one definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, all the while expecting different results. If we want better results, if we want more balanced trade-offs between the three different parts of the triple challenge, we need to approach these decisions differently. This diagram is from the white paper that Margaret referred to at the start, which we've published to go alongside this session. It's pretty clear that there are some things that governments, businesses, communities can do, that we can all do, that will help to address all three components of the triple challenge, whether that's reducing food loss and waste, or rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions, educating girls and providing equal rights for women and access to reproductive health. All of these things are good things to do, and they will help across the board. The question is whether they'll be enough. We suspect from the evidence that we've seen that in places they won't be. There will still be some difficult decisions to make, still be some trade-offs to make between the different aspects of the triple challenge. It's not for us as WWF to say exactly what the answers to those trade-offs should be. It'll be for local decision makers to make those decisions in light of their context and the perspectives from multiple stakeholders and rights holders. The positive thing is that we know that there are solutions that can work, and they have worked in places. So on the top left of this slide, you see changes in electricity generation source in the UK over the last 50 years. There's been a marked downward trend in generation of electricity from coal-fired power stations and an increase in generation of electricity from renewable sources, in particular from solar and wind. And it's worth saying this graph is 5 years out of date. Those trends have accelerated in the last 5 years. The bottom left-hand graph shows changes in the share of global population who are undernourished between 2000 and 2018. Now, it's not universal good news. There's been some recent trends in sub-Saharan Africa which aren't happy. But what you generally see is a reduction in the share of the global population who are undernourished. We've made progress in terms of food security and nutrition globally. Of course, there's plenty more to do. On the top right-hand side of this slide is a paper which WWF led in conjunction with scientists and other NGOs from around the world, really looking at freshwater biodiversity loss, the kind of things that we're worried about in places like the Mekong or the Great Ruaha. Freshwater biodiversity loss is a major concern. We've seen something like 80% reductions in populations of freshwater vertebrates over the last 50 years, for example. What this paper makes clear is that there are solutions out there, and they're not theoretical solutions. We produced a 6-point plan, and all of the points in the plan are proven solutions. They've actually been implemented successfully somewhere in the world. The question is, how do we scale them up to achieve greater impact? And there are tools out there which can be very helpful as we tackle this as well. Tools like Pareto optimal analysis, for example. On the bottom right-hand side of this slide is a graph from a Pareto optimal analysis that was carried out looking at challenges or trade-offs between hydropower generation and irrigation in countries like Nepal and Kenya. Pareto optimal analysis is very good for providing decision makers with a set of options which they can then consider. But of course, the triple challenge isn't just a scientific challenge. It's fundamentally a challenge that's political and social and cultural in nature. In our white paper, we said that one of the really key things that we have to push for is policy integration between relevant sectors. Now, policy integration is something that environmentalists often call for. In practice, it's actually quite difficult to do for all sorts of reasons. Some of them good, perhaps. Some of them more to do with short-termism or vested interests. So one of the questions we're grappling with, and I hope we'll get some insights in this session on it, is, well, how far can you push policy integration between agriculture and food, between energy, between environment sectors? And if you do want policy integration, how do you bring that about? What are the enabling factors? How do you overcome barriers? The second question is really about stakeholders and rights holders. What are the best ways of engaging them in decisions about the triple challenge in different contexts? And how do you balance stakeholder and right holder interests versus often powerful vested interests? And then a third question that we're grappling with is, well, what are the priorities for tools, for research, for innovation that can guide decision makers as they grapple with the triple challenge? I think now is a very good moment to be considering these issues, to be considering the triple challenge. In the previous session, there was quite a lot of discussion about this. Of course, 2020 was meant to be a super year for sustainability with the climate COP and the biodiversity COP and an important meeting about the SDGs. Some of those meetings are now being postponed, so perhaps we're talking about super years rather than a super year. Nevertheless, it's likely that these issues are going to be higher up the minds of many governments over the next couple of years. So it's a good moment to have them thinking about the connections between different sectors and different policy priorities. Of course, COVID has interrupted all of that and to some extent perhaps become the overriding policy priority, at least in the immediate future. But as we heard in the previous situation, COVID also presents an opportunity. We heard this phrase, build back better, used quite a lot. There's a real opportunity to mobilize the massive public investments that we're seeing to support sustainable solutions that support sensible ways through the triple challenge. That's about all I wanted to say. I hope that tees up the discussion well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Dave. It's really great to have the white paper land in places. All three examples you gave really help us understand better the trade-offs, the opportunities, the way all these things are really closely linked on the ground. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to invite you to click on the link in the chat box to access a poll we've set up for you. A number of you maybe noticed beforehand that the poll's been open. When you click on the link, you can select WWF from the list and then fill out the poll. We'll share the results at the end of the session. I just wanted to draw your attention to that now. As I said when we opened, the Triple Challenge requires us to integrate ideas and perspectives, ideas and expertise. We have a great group of panelists joining us from around the world for what we hope will be a vibrant interdisciplinary conversation as we look at this potential for win-win or trade-offs and how we manage between them. First, let me introduce Andre Fourie. He's Global Director of Water Sustainability at Anheuser-Busch InBev, the world's largest brewer. He leads the company's work on water stewardship, such as investing in watershed protection in high-stress areas. Welcome, Andre, and it's nice to see you again. Tanya Eulalia Martinez Cruz is a member of the Ayuk indigenous community in Oaxaca, Mexico. She holds 2 degrees in engineering and a PhD in social sciences. She has extensive experience in rural and agricultural development, climate justice, gender, and social inclusion, and she promotes the conservation of indigenous knowledge as a key to solving global problems. Welcome, Tanya. Thank you very much for joining us here this morning. Musonda Mumba is Chief of the Terrestrial Ecosystems Unit at UN Environment. Previously, she led the Ecosystems-Based Adaptation Mountain Program, a joint initiative between UN Environment, IUCN, and UNDP, working in Peru, Nepal, and Uganda. She's also been UN Environment's focal point on mountains and worked for freshwater conservation in Eastern Africa. It's great to see you here this afternoon, Musonda. And Melissa Pinfield is a senior fellow at the Meridian Institute, where she's executive director of the Just Rural Transition Secretariat. Previously, Melissa was program director of the Food and Land Use Coalition. She specializes in working with governments, private sector, civil society, and international institutions to facilitate and support the evolution of multi-stakeholder initiatives. Thank you so much for joining us, Melissa. So I want to start with a question on COVID-19. And one of the things Dave ended his presentation with, we were all working very hard this year for the super year. And COVID-19 obviously has us focused on other things, the health impacts of the pandemic, the economic impacts of the efforts to stem the spread of the pandemic, and how that has changed what we can expect and hope to get out of the super year. Musonda, I'd like to turn to you first. I know that at the end, for example, of the climate COP in Madrid, you were really excited about the opportunities that we faced in the next year, in this year. How much have things changed? Is this triple challenge still relevant for us today? Climate, food, nature, are all of those things relevant? Are different parts of it relevant? And maybe a follow-up, how realistic is it to expect these win-win solutions? Are we really mainly looking at trade-offs now, maybe even more than before?
Thank you so much, Margaret, and thank you very much for WWF for organizing this amazing panel. And really, I just want to tell the audience, please read the white paper, because for me, it just articulates a lot of the conversations we've been having for years and really puts into context the intersectionality of these complex issues, and yet also telling us, and I think what COVID has done, Margaret, is that it really has put front and center all the 3 elements. For example, I think COVID has brought to the reality that our nutrition is very central to our survival. Our food systems are very central. For the longest time, it's been like we've been banging on, tables and doors and heads and asking people, we have to have nutritious and biodiverse agroecological systems. And here we are, a pandemic showing us that this is so needed. I mean, people are dying because either their immunity is not good, they've been eating the wrong food, our soils are destroyed, and landscapes are degraded, etc. But also at the same time, what the pandemic has done is to show us that climate change did not stop. I mean, we saw all those amazing pictures of NASA showing us, oh my goodness, from the space. I mean, just basically demonstrating that pollution has stopped. All the spewing of greenhouse gases has been reduced because of industry reducing and all of that. But the reality is that all of a sudden we're going back to that old world. And we saw how flooding was happening in East Africa not very long ago, just a few weeks ago, because of the impacts of climate change. And so what COVID also manifested was that because of degradation, we're encouraging and really showing how zoonosis gets closer to us. So by taking away biodiversity from our systems, we suffer. And what the realities are that, and I think in a very strange twist of fate, this is the super year moment. This is the moment that really Mother Earth tells us, now you have to reflect on how you exist and how you live. And I find it really ironic because even though the processes, the multilateral processes that I'm involved in as somebody who's working as a UN diplomat are pivotal, it also shows the centrality and importance of these multilateral processes, how we need to come together because this pandemic shut all of us down collectively as a planet. And I think this is the opportune moment. When we say build back better, build back greener, what does that actually mean in reality? What does that mean for Africa? What does that mean for Europe? What does that mean for Asia? What does that mean for Latin America? What does that mean as a collective community? And how do we go forward? And I think we have this window, this just window, to really begin to define how we go forward and really have those win-wins, as it were.
Melissa, a follow-up question to that. So you spend a lot of time at this intersection between policymakers, government at many levels, local communities, business. Do you see trade-offs right now, or do you also see this sort of mostly win-win story?
I mean, at the systems level, anyone who's also read the Food and Land Use Coalition Growing Better report that came out September last year, we showed through that at the systems level, there doesn't need to be a trade-off. We can achieve these triple wins, but it requires a really urgent global reform agenda. At the country level, I think, as David's presentation made so clear, the trade-offs are very real, and so how do we move towards a situation where we can make the best possible evidence-based decisions is really key, but it's also through an inclusive engagement process. So what we in the Food and Land Use Coalition, we've developed these country platforms where we're working very, very closely with a range of government departments, from environment, from health, from agriculture. We know in reality a lot of the time that there's a difference in the power structure of often you'll see in agriculture and energy departments are much more powerful in systems than environment. But actually by bringing them together, doing a multi-stakeholder consultation, often that will be the first time you get officials from those different departments in a room together. And you may start to see that, the people from the environment department see, but there's these health benefits that we could bring into our story, we'd start to make some traction if we can kind of bring these together. So I think the key thing that I've seen that really can help cut through is political leadership. You need to have a recognition that things can't keep going the same that they have been before. You need to sort of unite behind what do we all have in common? How can we bring these different challenges together and get behind an agenda that we all can find something and share in? And you do need, I think you do need strong technical capacity. You need capacity at government level. You need it all the way down to the local level as well. There are tools out there, but we need to make these accessible, and we need to make these easy to use, and we need to really boost the capacity within governments and also with that sort of multi-stakeholder consultation so that we can bring all the diverse players to the table, farmers groups, indigenous groups, others who've got substantial vested interests in the system at the moment. And people need to sort of find, and it's going to be different from country to country. This is going to play out differently from country to country, but where people can kind of come up with that integrated strategy with a long-term plan that can bring all of these agendas together. Also, what I've found is where that is actually, geospatially explicit. We need to know, what are the areas of land that is most suitable for, intensive agricultural production? What are the areas that have the highest carbon stock, highest biodiversity value? And so finding those, having a good understanding of that is absolutely critical. Understanding the perspectives and who's going to win and lose, and then bringing those people who are potentially going to lose out from this transformation, finding ways to address their concerns and their needs, and finding ways to incentivize and reward those who are sort of at the front line, the producers of food, or those indigenous communities who are playing such a crucial role, protecting, stewards of environmental protection as well. So, sort of incentivizing and rewarding that behavior is absolutely crucial.
Now that's great. I want to get back to that tools question in a minute in the local communities. But first, I want to go to you, Andre, on this question of multi-stakeholder and political leadership around incentives and rewards. How do you think about that as a private sector actor in a landscape? Do you feel like you're consulted when these programs are put together? Is your voice heard? Do you have a way? How do you think about the trade-offs? Do the policies get in your way? Do they help? And how do you come to the table to engage on these issues?
Thanks, Margaret. Reading the white paper to me seems that we, as the private sector, we're going to have to go from thinking how do we better protect climate and biodiversity and food systems to how do we do better business through thinking about the connections between these three factors. We know that despite the policy institutional issues, which I'll comment on in a second, there are enormous opportunities if we do the right thing. So in climate mitigation, we know we can save money from renewable electricity. And adaptation for us, that means very much water, and investing in watershed protection, etc. Green infrastructure makes a massive opportunity for us. Investing in better agriculture, not just in our own agricultural supply chain, but upstream agriculture and improving it and how that impacts downstream. In agriculture, to think not just about the food systems, but how do we make our contribution into that in terms of better breeding, better varieties that are more resilient to floods and drought, more productive, etc. So we know that there are massive opportunities to do better business despite the policy and institutional challenges. And I think the two issues that we should take on as the private sector ourselves that we are not making progress is firstly collaboration. So many companies, including ourselves, work on water funds, but you tend to find one company with one NGO and some local stakeholders in one water fund, instead of really scaling up and having 20 or 30 companies together in a collaborative effort. And the same on sustainable farming, which there's huge, amazing work happening, but it tends to be individual companies with individual farmers, and we all tend to ask the farmers to do slightly different things, to report different things on the environmental performance and biodiversity, etc. So everyone is asking the right thing, but we're actually complicating the system rather than making it easier. So that's the first, is the collaboration. And the second one is your question on policy and institutional feedback. I don't think we provide smart enough feedback in terms of how to get the incentives going. We've seen with our work with WWF in Zambia, looking at the Kafui system, that there's huge policy contradictions, in terms of promoting hydropower, large-scale agriculture, tourism, the water economy, and the cities, and the decisions just contradict each other, and you end up with less than optimal outcomes. But we're not really schooled at providing the right feedback, and I think, again, it comes to better collaboration, because if one company, even if we give feedback with very good intentions, it's heard as in speaking in self-interest. But if we collaborate with a number of companies or working with others, such as the work that we did with WWF in Gafui, we see that policymakers hear that very differently going forward.
That's a very helpful example. Tanya, I want to turn to you because we talk a lot about sort of local stakeholders, and how does this look as it lands, this sort of integrated approach and the trade-offs between, or the not trade-offs between, how you think about climate, how you think about food, how you think about nature? What's in it for a local community? And how does this look when it all comes together in a local community? And I'd also invite you, if you would like, on your given your own background, comments on Andre's point about the infrastructure piece, and how you think about this landscape and the linkages of elements along the landscape, and how you get potentially green infrastructure into your landscape.
Thank you very much. So that's an interesting question, because I think particularly in Latin America, I want to talk about indigenous communities, because there has been like a lot of defense of territories against many of the big projects. So there's like an important role of policy. I just want to quote something that I heard from a farmer a couple of months ago. He used to say, with the Green Revolution, first we were told that we needed to intensify agriculture. We needed to produce more. And then when all these issues of climate change emerged, then we were told we needed to revert our processes and do things differently. But if I think back on many of these indigenous communities, thinking again in this crisis of the COVID, I was back in my community some weeks ago when all this started, and they started to lock down collectively because they act more like in a collective and not allowing people to come from the outside, because that meant they could be like a risk for the whole community if infrastructure is not good enough. But then I was wondering, are we going to be able to be self-sufficient with the food? And then I was just like reflecting on that, and then people were saying, yes, we're going to be self-sufficient. And actually we saw many people that has migrated to urban areas coming back to my community and rural communities, because they have like more this sense of a survival, because again, like comes to a collective. And I think that's something that has been said a lot in the conversation. We need to think more as a collective. Again, we focus a lot on the individual, and policy plays an important role, I think, because if I think on the cities, for example, we need to re-educate ourselves on what we eat, what we consume, healthy diets, but at the same time, making food accessible. In a community can be more or less easy if you have the resources to cultivate your land, if you have water, but in the cities, you are relying a lot on the market, right? So we need to sort of also think on how we're gonna supply food in urban setups, more like in a local scale at the same time. So yeah, I think there's like a lot to do, but also in education, because that's a key role. But coming back to the communities and the defense of territories, I think we need to listen more to the communities, because many times we implement policies and projects, and I want to reflect back in my community again, because I was thinking, how is that we survive? How is that we can be self-sufficient now? Well, I was mentioning the Green Revolution and all these approaches on intensifying agriculture, right? They look down into that sort of agriculture, like the small scale agriculture, but at the same time that make these people resilient. And we need to think of, I like to talk more about sovereignty rather than security, because I think first we need to try to see we can produce at local scale as much as we can to provide our people. Because when we also export foods, and I think that's something that was mentioned in the session before, we are also exporting natural resources, labor, and then we might be contributing also to all of these different inequalities. So we need to also reinforce a laws or policy that also takes into account more these trade-offs when we are also taking resources or food from one place to other. Yes, everyone needs to be guaranteed the right to food, but we also need to think on what we're costing on these areas, the global south, where usually is this food produced.
Where have you seen that done well? Because I think
Where
everyone's in agreement, and maybe Andre gave the example in the Kafui, but we're all in agreement on the general approach, but it seems there's a dearth of examples where it actually has been done well, or that we're not sharing enough when it actually works well.
Well, I think there are not well-known cases, but I think it's happening in many communities. Just where I was doing my research, for example, for my PhD, communities migrated and left the farming for some time, but then they realized they needed to continue cultivating if they wanted to be resilient and self-sufficient. And when things like the COVID or other disasters happen, if you're producing locally, then you can survive. So I think what happened many times is, like, I think there are initiatives, but they are not they are not voiced yet. But I think there are some approaches in a general level. If you think of fair trade, for example, I think that's a good way or a good start. And I think there are several institutions that are sort of leading some of these processes. Yeah, those are some examples I could give. Probably.
Musonda, have you, a double question on this, have you seen this done well first? And then second, how do we share that information in a way that people can find it more easily?
Thank you so much, Margaret. Tanya, you actually touched really on the node in terms of how the power of community has demonstrated here. Margaret, not so long ago on Earth Day, us as UN Environment, together with our center in Denmark, CITICN, and several partners, we did what we're called the Earth Science Cafes. And on one of those cafes, we had an expert from Harvard, Julia Watson, who's written a book this thick on examples of indigenous technologies around the world. It was amazing and it was fascinating. I'm happy to, and I think it's Low Tech, L-O, and then Tech, T-E-K. That's the title of the book. And it's fantastic because she really went around the world and said, why are we, it's back to the point that you mentioned, Tanya, this green revolution, and why are we not looking inside in these communities? And I think this is why the Food and Agriculture Organization had the UN Decade on Family Farming, to really show, it started 2019, it's going to be finishing in 2028, to really demonstrate that it is these small family farms that have actually sustained the planet. And just since I have the floor, I really just want to mention, Andrew, thank you so much for that point, because I actually did my PhD on the Kafue Flats, looking at the impact of the hydroelectricity dam on the actual protected area management, the Kafue Flats. And I'll tell you what, that level of policy confusion is the most problematic. This is a landscape that has invasive species, already compromising the the endemic species, the black lechwe that is there, and also has implications on the very business that the Mazabuka area has, which is growing sugar. So these complexities, and then the elements similar to the Ruaha area where I used to work when I worked at WWF with Dave, similar to the Ruaha area, we've had climate change issues in Zambia to an extent that the country has about 8 hours of power failure because we are so dependent on hydroelectricity. And then here we are, a landlocked country that has no port, no gas, no access to a sea, and dependent on the natural resources, charcoal, for energy. So we see these complexities just manifesting and showing you how this triple challenge really shows in reality, and really, and back to Melissa's point, the policy and the political drive is so critical and so important in going forward.
Well, that's great. There's a lot of questions coming in from the group, and I want to turn to those in just a second. Before I do, and I'll start with another question too. Before I do, please make sure to add to your to the Q&A. You can vote on others' questions, and a reminder that the poll is open. In case you're not able to see the link to the poll in the chat section, if you refresh your page, you should be able to see it. Or if you're watching from the mobile app, you can find the link in the comments. So again, the poll's still open, so just want to draw your attention there to the poll. So I want to turn to a couple of questions from the audience. For Melissa or Andre, What do you say about the triple challenges in view of fast human population growth? Can we achieve sustainable future in an ever-growing world of economic development? And maybe I'll start with you, Melissa, on that question.
Hi, yeah, so I mean, we did look at this in the Food and Land Use Coalition Growing Better report. So what we demonstrated through the analysis of that was that it is possible to feed a growing human population by 2050. But as I mentioned earlier, that this is going to take a very, very comprehensive reform agenda. And one of those is actually around that sort of demographic and gender issue. So, you know, we do need to kind of bend the curve and make sure that we don't just, you know, we focus on reproductive health and maternal health and all of these issues at the same time. What's really critical, though, in the modeling that we undertook was that if we can achieve this whole reform agenda, essentially what it rests upon then is that instead of using 400 million hectares of additional agricultural land to feed that population by 2050, by reducing food loss and waste, by shifting diets, and by promoting, you know, increasing agricultural yields, we can actually save, you know, 1.5 billion hectares of land, and that can be used then to protect forests, to protect critical ecosystems. If, however, we delay in taking climate action, if we become very reliant on BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, then we will lose those biodiversity benefits and climate benefits. And so it's really crucial that we take action now across all of those, all of the critical transitions that we outline in the report.
Thanks. Andre, same question to you.
Yeah, I'm not a policy expert on that. I mean, there's no doubt that the growing number of people impacts on how we consume the resources we require, the amount of water we need, the amount of land we need for food. And as the demographics change, you know, people in urban areas use more water, produce more waste, etc. But my sense is that the best response is not, because I think somewhere we've seen some direct population measures, trying to measure numbers of population, that ends up being quite destructive, but that the number of populations would be an outcome. If we do the right things on climate mitigation and adaptation, if we do the right levels of investment and development, people development and protecting nature, I think it will manage and mitigate over time.
Yeah, thank you for that. Question for Tanya. How does the ever-growing economic development paradigm impact the food system? And maybe a related question, what role can a shift to plant-based diets play in benefiting on all three issues?
Okay, so I think I want to start with the second question. So I think what can happen is let me just give you an example with a recent law that was approved in Mexico on native maize, for example. Like a lot of hybrids have been promoted in Mexico, and we had been like a bit reluctant to grow maize. Maize, it's like so linked to the culture of the Mexicans. But that also means like it was linked to intensified agriculture. One reason for these native seeds to coexist for many years is because they are adapted to marginal conditions that could be sometimes poor soils, a drought tolerant, or etc. So farmer has adapted that for many, many, many years. But what happened is like, again, these seeds or these food, just let me call again the milpa system or other traditional systems, because like the market has set a specific standard on foods. Let's just think when we go to the supermarket, what do we pick up when we go to the supermarket? We want the prettiest tomatoes or whatever we choose, but we don't really think on what's behind all the, let's say, production process. So we need to think more on how it's also produced. That's why I bring like this idea of these traditional food systems, because many of these times when we talk about farming communities, not only indigenous communities, but these people that farms in a small scale. I see there's like a lot of love and care on the way they produce food. And we cannot monetize that. And we need to also value how this is produced. That's what I also mean by we need to think on how we think or change our diets. If you go also to the cities, you see in many cases getting fast food is cheaper than getting a fresh veggie. So we need to make accessible food to everyone, not only this fast food, because like what Musonda was mentioning, like diets also are playing a strong effect on who's getting affected by the COVID. We are realizing we are a society that is not well fed. And so we need to think about that. Can you repeat the first question? I missed a bit of the first question, sorry.
Sure. How does the ever-growing economic development paradigm impact the food system?
That's an interesting question. I think we need to think again on what we want to achieve more as a collective society, because I think corporations or the powerful people has set the agenda for what development actually means. And we need to rethink what do we mean by development? We need to think, what do we want to achieve in a way? And I want to give the example of one of the farmers in one of the communities I was working in. Everyone has migrated in that community, and everyone could go to the US as temporary workers and get houses, bigger cars, and things like that. And I asked him, why you haven't left? Why you never left your community? And he told me something really powerful, that was because I want to be my own boss. Here I have my house. Here is my territory. Here I can go and crop my land, grow my food, and I'm my own boss. And I want to be in peace. I don't have to be rushing. So I think we need to rethink what development actually means and try to take and embrace other perspectives. And I think we sort of have failed in that.
I think all of us can relate to that, farmer or not, for sure. It's a great point. Go ahead, Melissa, on that.
I just wanted to build a bit on the discussion about plant-based diets. I think that we are seeing in quite a lot of places, there's a real interest to sort of go back to more traditional diets. The governor of West Papua, for example, sort of, really recalls that in his youth, there was, the way that people ate was quite different. And he's got a vision for West Papua where, they will really start to grow again, the sweet potato and the legumes and the beautiful diversity of vegetables there that he had in his childhood. But now, of course, there's a lot of, they're highly dependent on imports of things like white rice and those and instant noodles, which are very low in nutritional content. And so, similarly in Ethiopia, we're seeing, really strong interest in how to promote sort of high nutritional teff as well, and kind of linking that vision of, increasing production of teff in a way that's also environmentally sustainable. In China as well, there is interest at the political level of saying that's not sort of, they don't want to see a shift to, what they would call the Western diet, but, how to kind of really bring, not make that an assumption that is the direction of travel, but to kind of make sure that the, more traditional Chinese diet, which is really high in that kind of, diverse range of vegetables and nuts, is actually, can remain central to the Chinese diet. So I think diet is really local and needs to be culturally placed as well. What's also important in the discussion about the shift to the plant-based diet is that and this was, there was quite a lot of discussion on this after the Eat Lancet report on human and planetary health came out, which is that in some places, we will need to see an increase in animal protein consumption where it can specifically address some of it will be the best path to address some of the malnutrition issues there. So in a lot of Western economies, we would need to see a decrease in the amount of red meat consumed to meet health needs, actually. But in some other cultures and some other geographies, we will need to see an increase. So I think it's very context specific, but it's really important to take those kind of local, cultural and health factors into account.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa, for that addition. It was a really great report for any of you who haven't taken a look at it yet. Musanda, I want to ask a slightly different question. And this came up in the session before ours as well. How can governments better value nature? And what's the role of lobbying and advocacy? And then maybe, Andre, to you, how can companies and investors better value nature?
Thank you for that, Margaret. I'm going to give a concrete example of how governments can best value nature, because just yesterday, the government of Rwanda announced very publicly in the region, it was on all the televisions, internet, that they have banned the use of charcoal in Kigali. Kigali is a 1.4 million people city. And the reason President Kagame and his government did that was because they're seeing high rates of deforestation, particularly within the Greater Virunga landscape, and this is a landscape that spreads between Rwanda, Uganda, and Congo DRC, the only space on this planet where we have the mountain gorillas. So it's in the interest, the tourism industry and their revenue depends on people coming to see these mountain gorillas. But at the same time, here we are seeing high levels of degradation, deforestation, and all of that. So for me, the leadership matters. And I think we're seeing a lot of examples of this kind of works. On the same vein, I mean, Rwanda was way ahead of a lot of countries around the world on spearheading the whole sustainable, consumption and production by banning plastic. I mean, I remember a few years ago, I mean, not even a few years ago, I remember almost 8 years ago going into Rwanda for the first time. I was so shocked. The person in the hotel literally warned me, the cleaner in the hotel told me, "Madam, I've seen that you have your plastic with your shoes. Please take that back with you to wherever you came from." She was that empowered to be bold enough to tell me as a customer there. In terms of the lobby and advocacy, I think what we're beginning to see is that even at the multilateral process level, for example, us as the UN Environment together with FAO, we're working and we've been instrumental in supporting governments like El Salvador present the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration at the highest level, at the UN General Assembly. And the larger component, which is focusing on advocacy, is going to be really all around working with all the stakeholders, WWF, indigenous peoples, communities, really making a movement around the issue of restoration. It's huge. And this is not even something that we can do at the UN level. This is something that starts bottom up. And I think that's where, champions, kingdoms, royal houses. I mean, I was fortunate enough to just have conversations with people within the, the Royal House of Monaco, the Prince of Monaco, the Queen of Buganda, the King of the Ashanti Kingdom in Ghana. All these royal houses are mobilizing and advocating for restoration within their constituencies. So we're beginning to see non-state actors doing all of that. And we're beginning to see young people. I mean, don't even start me on young people. Look at the Gretas of this world. Look at all the young people across the world. Really lobbying and advocating and really championing for change and shift in their communities. And in a lot of ways, just saying, you're either with us or just get out of the way, because we really want to do this, because we're not even just the future, we're the present. And I think the young constituency will be a lot more instrumental in this build back better, build back greener, and challenging governments, challenging them. Is this the way we're supposed to be going? We thought we should learn something from COVID. And I think they'll be the ones to really call it out and challenge us as well.
And let's hope we're all listening too. Yeah. Andre, same question to you. So how do companies better value nature and to this point that leadership really matters? You also have the opportunity to exert leadership here, and I know you have done that a lot at AB InBev. Love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I think the first step is to just try and understand how do we appreciate the value of nature, and just to take a take stock of where you see the value of nature in your company and supply system. So I mean, the obvious examples like pollination, etc. So huge advantages that you get without paying for it or being aware of it. And then it becomes really visible when you try and address when it's not there. So why do we invest in reforestation? In order to protect our watersheds. You know? It's not hard to work out in terms of the value that reforestation brings to the soil, to runoff of water, to the recharge of water, to the local aquifer, to the managing the quality, stopping the silting, etc. So we see huge value in restoring it. So often it helps to think about it beforehand. The same in removing alien vegetation in order to restore biodiversity, to see the value for our watersheds, etc. So we often can see the value to restore it, but maybe we should just switch that round. But I think a key part of that is the monetizing, to try and understand it. And I want to explain that a little bit in two parts. The first is bringing a monetary value is really important in terms of helping companies value it compared to other assets that they have. And we're busy with a project with WWF to look in across Africa in terms of better understanding a spatial analysis of where you can actually see investment in nature-based solutions. We often talk about it globally, hey, of course there's advantage, but really try and quantify and monetize that, and looking at what are the policy contradictions and policy analysis that flow from it. But the flip side to me of the monetize is not because I think we can really value it only in terms of dollar terms. It really is just an instrument to help us think through. There's no ways that we can compare natural capital with some of the other capitals. It has a unique nature of itself, and it has a cumulative impact in terms of either growing or degrading over time. So in short, I think the private sector needs to become much more aware of the value we already have before we're forced to invest in restoring it.
You know, I'm sort of struck as you started. It feels so natural. You know, it's obvious we should invest in reforestation because it improves the quality of the soils, and the improvement in the quality of soils, it improves the quality of the water and the quantity of the water that you use as a fundamental part of your supply chain. Is it really that natural? Did it take a lot for the company to come to that realization? You say it, and one might think, you know, every company obviously sees all these benefits. You know, how do you get from here to there?
Yeah, I think firstly, being a beer company, we are depending on quality water and quality ingredients. I think we have a much more natural value chain, and therefore it maybe comes easier to us than in other companies. It might be easier to explain to others. At a watershed level, it is as natural and as easy as you say. If you do the analysis, so it's not always the right solution to every problem. But I'm really surprised at how you have 2 or 3 categories of watershed responses that appear in probably 75% of cases. And one is either reforestation or protecting biodiversity, and the other one is often promoting better agriculture upstream, because otherwise you're going to sit with the problem downstream. So these things come out. Your question in terms of decision makers, no, you do sometimes have the same executive ask 2 or 3 times in a row, explain to me exactly how we benefit from investing in this again, you know? So yeah, sure, people who don't live and breathe it every day, it's not as natural as it might be for us. But for us as a company, we can see the benefits.
Thanks. I want to switch gear a little bit from another question from our participants. Maybe I'll start with Tanya on this one. What's the role of gender equality in addressing the 3 challenges? And then I'll go to any one of you after that.
Yeah, I would say in terms of food security, and actually they are all connected, just like thinking about that. In terms of food security in nature, I think we need to think of women, if I talk about the households, many times we are the ones that decide what we're going to feed our families, right? So we play a crucial role. In terms of nature, a lot of the knowledge, I'm going to speak again from the perspective of many of the indigenous communities, are the keepers of all this knowledge, and it's passed from one generation to other. So yes, again, so we play an important role. But I think in terms of policy, yes, I'm so happy that, for example, in this session, we are several women. But in many cases, like still the political participation in terms of policy making has still a way to go to include more voices. And I think just like thinking on these perspectives I was mentioning in terms of nature, but I want to talk, yes, gender, but intersectionalities again, because I think we need to think on these, yes, gender, but also other minority voices that haven't really been taken into account in mixing these three different issues. But it has to come to a policy level, I think. That's where you will materialize everything.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to come in on this question? This is always my favorite question.
Thank you for that, Margaret. I think I'll respond to it with sort of a practical example, because for me, first of all, being Zambian and someone who grew up in a rural setting and training as an environmentalist and as a scientist, I didn't see anyone that looked like me. And I always, in a predominantly male dynamic. And then in my trajectory of my journey, my environmental journey took me to so many places around the world and back again to Africa. And here I was being on the table, being invited to, to meetings, and I was the only one at the table talking about environmental issues and the only woman. And I thought, oh, this cannot be the case. I'm shocked. I reached out to many women across the continent, and I was surprised, incredibly surprised, the number of young, environmentalists who've been trained, agriculture sector, researchers, scientists, name it, until I was deliberate about actually setting up, through our agency, setting up the first ever network of African women environmentalists. And I can tell you, it's like the number of women who've come out of the woodworks. But also as a mother, for me, traditionally, we're dependent on our food system. For, as a lactating mother, I was taught traditionally, this is the food you need to eat. This is what you need for you to be able to produce milk. And it's predominantly plant-based. And it's fascinating sort of navigating that as somebody who went to London, did my PhD and came back and being told by my grand aunts and my family, oh, this is the vegetable that you need to eat because you're pregnant. And then when you have the baby, you're lactating, you're going to eat vegetable X and Y. And so women are so central and pivotal, not just from the knowledge perspective, but also from the cultural perspective. So when we lose this biodiversity, we're losing a huge chunk of our culture and losing a huge chunk of our knowledge. And that is so central and fundamental. And the men, of course, are part of that whole, back to what Tanya says in terms of the intersectionality. So for me, I think the gender element is so critical. And I think this is why the Sustainable Development Goals advocate around that aspect to say, let's not leave no one behind. And we need to have those voices at the table. And I think what is really wonderful is that our UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been so instrumental in drumming it on and on and on and about that. Tomorrow, we're going to have the World Environment Day, where the theme is time for nature. And I think a lot of the videos and stories we've seen around the centrality of women in securing biodiversity, but also making sure that we have conversations around why climate change is changing everything and making them more vulnerable in their landscapes, in their spaces, and in their communities as well.
Thanks. Those are great examples, and always good to go back to the reminder from Tanya that it's not just about women, it's also about gender, it's also about a voice. And the intersectionality and why we have so many different perspectives needed in this conversation, because there are some things that are quite key for food, some things that are quite key for climate, some things that are quite key for biodiversity. But what's clear to all of us is that you can't do any of them without integrating the whole. Another question. Oh, this is a good question. I'll take volunteers on this question. When a country promotes great harm to nature, should it be punished in any way for undermining global well-being? So we've talked a lot about the good examples. Let's talk a little bit about the bad examples and how we think about addressing or responding to the more challenging examples. Melissa, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah. I used to be a diplomat actually a long time ago. So yeah, how to be diplomatic in answering this. I think that increasingly, there's no place to hide with this stuff, and particularly, we're talking a lot about private sector here, and there's huge reputational risk from a lot of companies who are importing agricultural commodities associated with deforestation, for example. And, I think where there are really egregious cases of governments that are just, dispossessing people, there's land grabbing, there's a lot of violence towards sometimes Indigenous people. And I think where we are seeing sort of really, examples of that, then those who are financing, this or investing in this or purchasing, the commodity supply chains, really are vulnerable because they're consumers, and others don't want to be associated with these kinds of, frankly, environmental crimes. And so I think, one thing that you can, I know that a number of companies in recent months have sort of made their position quite clear. We've seen, examples before where, action has actually been led by the private sector to sort of say, enough is enough. We're getting too much heat on this issue. This government needs to do something differently. I think as well, there's the ability for information to move quite quickly and to understand what's happening is really there in a way that there isn't a place to hide on these issues. I mean, that said, it's still happening, and are we doing enough? Are we being strong enough? I think this is when maybe we need to do more, and we need to do more to sort of shine a spotlight. And do more to kind of, there's increasingly, I think governments are starting to look at what kinds of, it's what we've been talking about here is what are you doing domestically to kind of address these triple challenges. But one of the areas that, isn't captured in that is the trade and the spillover effects. And so, if you really want to have be strong and bold and have ambitious climate action, it's not enough just to say that, what you're doing domestically. But if you are importing commodities that have a massive sort of deforestation footprint, then, that in a way is kind of part of what you have to own as a government, as a country. So I think there are increasingly a number of governments that are looking at what more they can do to kind of introduce regulations that would make it clear that in the future, that those sorts of commodities would not be allowed to be imported into those countries. So sort of a combination between what the private sector can do and what governments can do to address this.
So this brings up a great point about, what's missing and what tools do we need? And Andre, one of the things that you mentioned, and I think maybe Musanda, you had mentioned this as well, is the increasing availability and usability of spatial data. And how the additional information it gives you, for example, in your ability to track supply chain, your ability to cite activities, your ability to see how the landscape interacts with an intervention in the landscape, and you can expand the scope of review with the information that you're now much more readily available to gather. It also increases transparency. What other sorts of tools, or maybe, Andre, if you want to talk specifically about the geospatial information, what other tools sort of enable this better decision making around the triple challenge, like geospatial information, so that we get better outcomes?
Yeah, so clearly the geospatial is hugely valuable, and particularly if you combine it with direct observation tools. So if you monitor water quality together with spatial tools, you get really interesting dynamic modeling of what's happening and what are the causes, and that helps impact. We also using NASA data on climate modeling to help farmers better understand not just the current spatial impact of rainfall patterns, but how that evolves over time. The second part of feedback is really just transparency on land use change. So a good example is a company would invest in renewable energy, a new wind farm, which sounds like a great investment, all for the right reasons. You could make the finance work, but transparency on, so what, was it land that was deforested or terribly changed for that purpose? And of course, for us, it's not just the impact on the land, but also local communities that were displaced, etc. So transparency on land use change and impact on communities is hugely valuable in making those decisions, because yes, you can put the burden on companies, and companies need to do their own due diligence, but that data or information is not always readily available. So surfacing it is really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Tanya, did you want to come in on this question as well? And I can come back to you, Melissa.
Yes, I think Andre is right. We need to increase transparency, and that's a way to go. And I'm just reflecting on something that in the context of Mexico, one of a network of indigenous women mentioned to me. They said, we are lacking data. And usually when we want to make statements or reinforce policy, we need that data. So yeah, there's like a lot of space or things to do in that respect.
Melissa, go ahead.
Yes, and just very quickly in the interest of time, I just wanted to add, I think WRI is now developing a fantastic tool. I think they're going to be launching in a few weeks or less than a few weeks, called TerraMatch, which is a matchmaking mechanism where to show the landscapes where degradation has happened and what communities are doing there, and matching them with potential donors or, to be able to support them, but also the visualizing, showing, it's a combination of things. I think beginning to visualize where landscapes are degraded and the possibilities of what, and to show the communities that this can be done, and they're being matchmaked with somebody they can trust and also work with, in able to restore their landscape. So we're beginning to see a lot of innovative platforms that are emerging. And I think more recently from the European community, there's been all discussions around the issue of taxation on green energy mechanisms. I think part of the reason a lot of governments, especially global South governments, or at least communities go, pear-shaped around the energy sector, is because they have no options, or there are no tax rebates on even all these mechanisms around the photovoltaic cells, etc. But what COVID has done is to really show us that we were all locked out as a landlocked country, someone coming from a landlocked country. Our borders were closed. We have no port. We had no supplies from China. And then here we were twiddling with our fingers thinking, oops, I think we should have some factories here in the country that are building some parts of these particular mechanisms. And I think there's need for a rethink right now on many ways. Otherwise, our biodiversity will continue to be impacted.
Yeah, Melissa, you wanted to come in on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different tools that are under development. It's a real, it's a very exciting time. Trace, Global Forest Watch, these sorts of things. In terms of the triple challenge, one of the tools that we have developed with the Food and Land Use Coalition is the Fable modeling tool. So this is working in 20 countries, so building capacity, working with research institutions across 20 or more countries. And that allows them to develop that sort of integrated long-term models that will look at, the effect of different policy decisions across food, agriculture, biodiversity, land use, and energy. And that is available then for policymakers to help them sort of assess those trade-offs. Another one that we've got in development is a food and land use action tracker, because it's really hard to sort of know, actually to get a really good sense of what are the policies that are out there and how are they actually starting to have an impact? How are we sort of starting to see what's bending the curve? So similar to the climate action tracker, it'll sort of really then develop methodologies to really understand, firstly, what are countries actually doing and implementing, and then how are they starting to, what are we starting to see where it's starting to shift towards, shift and bend the curve or meet their stated targets and goals.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. I'm watching the time. I have a very complicated challenge right now of summarizing all of this really great input. And I was thinking as each of you were talking about the recommendations that are in the white paper itself. And the recommendations in the white paper are sort of split between recommendations for policymakers, recommendations for researchers, recommendations for non-state actors. And you touched on virtually every one of the recommendations that came up, but maybe even more importantly is the integration of that work across those three sets of actors. We need interdisciplinary engagement and an open and transparent examination of the trade-offs, especially as they fall in specific places, because nearly every single one of you pointed out the differences in different contexts. So it's helpful to have global principles, it's helpful to have global recommendations, but at the end of the day, all of these fall in specific contexts. So you also need the tools for local actors to be able to understand and make those trade-offs, and you need transparency, you need data, you need the information to enable the trade-offs. It also, that information also enables people to understand where there are examples of things that have worked and how you might use those examples. And the great, this book this thick with examples already, how we share those with each other, how we enable the information to flow in a better way, and then how we're able then to take that information from one place and apply those lessons locally as we get better at managing this triple challenge. And then last, I think all of you clearly pointed out that not only has the COVID-19 maybe dual crisis of health and economic impact affected how we are thinking today about the challenges, maybe especially of food, but also of climate and also of nature loss. But it also highlights that it highlights the opportunity right now to really make sure that we deal with all these three challenges together. Because if we don't, we can't solve either that health challenge or the economic challenge that comes from trying to address the health challenge. I think with that, leadership matters. And I want to thank all of you for being leaders in this area, all of you for bringing your thoughts, your expertise. I want to thank Dave again for the great presentation at the top and the white paper. I know you do the virtual applause. And then, and I also want to thank all of you who provided great questions along the way. So I think this is a good time if we could pull up the poll results. We'll see where you ended up on the question. So the question, what would help better policymaking for the triple challenge? Clearly, the integration of policy across biodiversity, climate, and food. And I have to say, at the beginning of the discussion, I was expecting some of you, or even in the questions and the comments, to say it's all about trade-offs, and there is no way to bring this all together. And I'm maybe pleasantly surprised at how much consensus really there is about the need and the benefits of bringing all these three together. And then the next up, forward-thinking leaders or champions who can mobilize stakeholders, effective engagement of diverse interest groups, mechanisms and tools that allow trade-offs to be identified and quantified. So really great. Down at the bottom there, rounding out developing a compelling story. And let's not please forget about the science. We talked a lot about the science in the previous conversation. So really great conversation, great results on the poll. I want to remind you all, you can go find the white paper. I really highly recommend the white paper to you. I'd also really strongly recommend the Eat Lancet report, which was highlighted earlier. Great work on trade-offs. And I think each of you have, over the course of the conversation, shared various different tools And I want to give you each the opportunity as we just close up here. Give me your 3-word takeaway from the conversation before we head into the next one. And I'll give a wrap of the next one. After each of you get 3 words, let me go around in alphabetical order. Andre, to you first.
So collaboration, collaboration, collaboration.
Those are three great words. Melissa?
That took one of mine. I'm saying inspiring collaborative leadership.
That's great. Thank you, Masanda.
Time for nature.
Oh, I love that one. Thank you. Tanya? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat collaboration and transparency.
Thank you very much. All great words. So our next session, we'll dive deeper into one particular aspect of the Triple Challenge, which is diets. And we'll hear from a number of experts on the role of diets in improving human and planetary health. And I'd also like to remind you, recording of the session will be available on the GLF page, and the presentations will be uploaded as well after the close of our session. So we're going to give you a couple of minutes here to stretch out your legs. We'll be back exactly on the hour. And I understand that our excellent tech folks behind the scene, thank you to all the people that you can't see, Martin, Alice, Helma, Huma, and Nina, thank you so much for bringing us all together here, and our great tech support here. Martin is going to bring us some music as we get up and stretch. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.